Welcome to Dedicated. Today we're talking with Lea Carpenter. Lea is an author, editor, and screenwriter. She was founding editor of Francis Ford Coppola's literary magazine, Zoetrope. She also worked for a time years ago at JFK Jr.'s magazine, George. If you're a fan of literary espionage in the style of John le Carré, then she is an author you must read. Her latest is the novel Ilium. Lea writes with such force about the world of espionage, the New York Times, in a rave review, calls it deeply moving, among many other accolades. Lea, I'm excited you're here. It's great to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Doug. I'm so happy to be here. Can I make one slight comment on your introduction, which
Sure.
was totally lovely? But I should just say, especially in case she's listening, I was not technically the founding editor of Zoetrope. I was hired as the intern to make coffee for the founding editor, Adrian Brodeur. But because, Coppola, I mean, we could spend an hour just talking about him, had this real vision to create this publication. And he'd hired one woman to do it, this woman who is still a dear friend of mine, Adrian Brodeur. And I think I harassed her until she hired me. But in these kinds of small operations, I quickly evolved from making the coffee to learning how to be an editor. And I really learned it at her feet, how to do everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think there are a few articles out there that have fed Wikipedia with the other narrative. But
Probably.
So hopefully no one sort of grabs this and then goes to correct Wikipedia because, founding editor, that's kind of cool.
I know. Well, she was, I think when you're in your 20s, if you can find one or two people to learn from, you're really lucky. And she was the first person I found. And
was that first job out of college?
No, first job out of college was an internship at George magazine.
George was first. That's right. Yeah, I was looking at some of that. Your Wikipedia doesn't have the sequence down exactly.
God, I've never even looked at my Wikipedia, but yeah. So I went to George, and almost as soon as I was there, I knew that probably it wasn't the right place for me, although I learned a ton. It was an incredible group of people. Mm-hmm. And then I'd heard this rumor that Coppola was starting a literary magazine, which sounded so, to have so much potential. So I started writing to her. I guess they were emails at the time. And she finally said, look, okay, come on in. She couldn't put me off any longer.
And that led to start pouring our beer. So
yeah, terrific. Really
settle in. But she was,
and that led to years working for her.
One person?
Yeah, it was one person, Adrian. I was there really when she moved into the office, which was on Lower Fifth. We had a rug, 2 desks, 2 phones. And then when Francis Coppola came the first time to visit the office after I was there, he brought us...
Sorry.
Yes, a glass would be great, thank you.
Here, so.
He brought us a school table, which was a very exotic element to have in an office. But we had that table, and that's where a lot of the editing of the first issues happened. And I think his vision really was, my recollection of the vision was, why is it efficient to have development executives sitting in Los Angeles or San Francisco? Why wouldn't I rather have a literal literary magazine with editors in touch with writers who are writing new short fiction, writing new novels? Isn't that a better way to find future film and or television projects?
I want to ask you more about that because in particular, lately I'm reading so many good books, fiction and nonfiction, and seeing so many bad shows on the streamers in terms of movies. I'm like, why aren't they just grabbing these and putting them on? But before that, let's have a quick toast with the Heineken beer today. Great choice.
Thank you so much. It doesn't get any better than beer, but I know you've had so many smart cocktail choices on your show.
There have been some good cocktails, but it's a hot day today, and sometimes a cold beer is just what the doctor ordered.
Nothing better, thank you.
Well, before we get back to George and Francis Ford Coppola and things like that, you're born in Delaware.
Yes.
Okay, and Princeton undergrad.
Yes.
Right, where you studied English.
Yes.
All right.
I went there hoping to study comparative literature, and then it turned out that at the time there, you couldn't major in what I'll call a creative discipline. So there was no theater major. And I really wanted to act and get involved in the theater community. And the major that kind of dovetailed the best with that was English. So I was really an English major by accident. But
that's a pretty broad topic. So were you studying, literature or of, Russian lit, or what sort of, was there specialty within there?
It is a broad topic. I remember, you had to read these comprehensive histories of English literature that would have excerpts of the greats, and then you do your kind of comprehensive exams at the end. I ended up focusing on theater and theater literature, and so for my thesis, I wrote a thesis about a play, which was a play called The Maids, actually by a French writer, Jean Genet. But really for me, most of the work that I did was focused on playwrights, and those playwrights really became my literary heroes, whether it was, Tom Stoppard or Tony Kushner or Carol Churchill or,
You're out of my bailiwick. I know, like Eugene O'Neill and Tom Stoppard are the names I read. The other names I've never even.
They're good too. Well, it's I never thought I would be a writer, let alone a writer who tries to think about plotting things for film or television. But in terms of dramatic storytelling, everything goes back. Everything goes back to Aristotle and to these playwrights, and so it was a great way to get an education in how to tell a story.
Does it help you write dialogue more so? Because I would imagine writing either a screenplay or for a play is more dialogue driven.
I think if you sit around and you read, if you can take time and read a few Tom Stoppard plays, you will realize that dialogue at its best, it really is a kind of music. A lot of people have said Aaron Sorkin has a similar musical cadence to how he writes dialogue, and maybe we don't all speak the way Tom Stoppard's or Aaron Sorkin's characters speak, but there is real music in that. Everyone does dialogue differently, but I think there are definitely great television shows that have great dialogue.
Yeah. Sorkin is great, and his characters do have that. But my only criticism of Sorkin, and by the way, who am I to criticize Sorkin, but every character has that same music. They all have this they're all way more clever than I am. There's not a single dumb person in the show. They're all are incredibly witty, fast-paced dialogue, kind of smart.
And it's funny in an era when you hear a lot about how smart can you expect an audience to be? I've always thought that was preposterous. I always think, that the audience is owed, or the reader, the greatest possible respect for giving time to read something or listen to something or watch something that you might write. And I think, The West Wing now is 20 years old when it started. And that was a network show, but that was really a show that in my recollection of it, I haven't watched it again recently, but was talking about the most important issues of the day. I've said before of Aaron Sorkin, and I think it's really true, that there's so few writers who can, in the course of one scene, make you laugh and cry. And Sorkin does that. I've never met him, but he that is a very special skill.
Yeah, he's one of those names in TV that you just know. If it's got Aaron Sorkin on it, it's going to be of a certain quality. So after Princeton, soon after, you must have gone to George. So JFK Jr. died in 1999, I think, right?
Yeah, I went right out of school into that internship. I didn't even have a place to live. I was sleeping on a friend's couch. And it was, my mother had seen an article about the magazine in People magazine and cut it out. I had always had an interest in politics too. I'd spent summers interning in Washington for then Senator Joe Biden. And so politics and literature were kind of my two passions. And my mother saw a notice about George and said, "This sounds like a marriage of your interests." I had no idea what I was going to do. I thought I was going to apply to theater grad school and go be an actor or work in the theater. So I thought I'll park in this internship and see what comes out of it. And I found myself among such exceptionally talented editors and writers. I mean, it was very high-flying kind of stuff. And of course, John Kennedy. So I spent most of my time, hiding in my cubicle, terrified, until someone asked me to make copies. But it was, and I, have said before, I feel like George walked so that Morning Joe could run, whatever you think of a Morning Joe kind of show, or a current news show where you can have this intersection of culture and hard news. George came out, I think the first cover was Cindy Crawford dressed up as George Washington, but they had top journalists, top writers, and they really thought we can marry culture with political news journalism. And I think of a show like Morning Joe, where you can plausibly have a politician, and you can have, Bradley Cooper coming on to talk about his next project. But there used to be much more of a Chinese wall between those two subject matters. I mean, there was always a Vanity Fair where you had hard-hitting, investigative journalism, but this kind of what is high and what is low culture was, I think, when George came on the scene, we were still wrestling with what is the relationship between these two things? Can you marry them in one magazine?
Yeah, it was. I remember like Playboy magazine would occasionally try to do like a serious article on politics or something like that. It's like the crossover was almost hardly ever done.
Yes.
And I remember No magazine came out with bigger pizzazz, I think was maybe your word, than George. I mean, JFK Jr. was our royalty. He had tons of money behind it. And I think every famous person kind of wanted to be a part of it. But did it ever... So he died in 99. It was still going on, and maybe had a bit of a life after he passed away?
It was still going on. Like I said, I was only there for a few months, and it did go on for a bit after he died, but I don't remember how long. I think he was really the heart and soul of it, though. It was really his baby.
Yeah, I guess magazines were already starting to somewhat contract even by late 90s too. So he was kind of going into the teeth of it a little bit.
There was. I mean, we would...
Was he around the area where, was he in the offices?
Yeah,
you would see him
he was
and
in the
interact
office.
and talk story.
He was in the office.
Editorial?
He was in the office every day. One of his closest friends, who he'd gone to Brown with, was a guy called Gary Ginsberg, who kind of corralled me to be his personal intern. But Gary was there and went on to be a mentor of mine for, over the next decade. Again, it was probably in kind of the twilight of that kind of magazine, even though I think there wasn't a big sea change until the recession in 2008. But I think it was the beginning of a lot of changes in that industry, all of which you've seen. And I loved magazines. When I was a kid, back to growing up in Wilmington, on a special occasion, my parents would take me to New York City, and we would go through the train station. And I remember the highlight of being in a train station later in an airport was going and buying magazines. And whenever my mother or father traveled, they would bring home magazines. They were the conduit to culture for us, in our generation as kids. And I loved everything about them, and this marriage of art and words, and probably saw a bit of that in the theater too, when I kind of fell in love with the theater.
The 80s, 90s version for kids was thumbing through the magazines. Yes. Now they're scrolling through Instagram and other things, but the 80s, 90s was the magazine.
And there was something permanent. So now you can scroll through, take your pick, but it disappears. Mm-hmm. Scrolling is not a way of holding on to something. And those magazines that I stockpiled in my room as a kid were a way of holding on, remembering this cover, remembering that piece, tearing things out. My mother was a compulsive tearer outer she still is, of, pieces in the newspaper, pieces in magazines. And that's sort of disappeared. I can remember even just when my last book came out, which was in 2018, feeling there was a difference between, I'm going to write a piece and it will be published in this magazine versus they're going to run it online. Well, now, of course, I think that, again, back to binaries, I think that's sort of gone now. Now you want the link, right? Mm-hmm. So you can send it around more easily. But I loved those glossy magazines, later literary magazines. I think so much was said at one time for that as a delivery device for content. I mean, it's not all over yet, but it's certainly in our adult lifetime really changed.
Big national magazine, I think. There are niche magazines around aficionados of cigars or literary, things like that. But there isn't like Life magazine anymore.
It's really too bad in a way, because I think the culture could kind of coalesce around stories or narratives or images that those publications, because they had such authority, could deliver to us. And those images, those myths, whether it's JFK's love for Camelot, which, famously Mrs. Kennedy reported to Arthur Schlesinger days after he died. It's those myths that kind of helped us cohere as a culture in a way that we're not doing that so much anymore. I mean, we'll coalesce around maybe a TV show, but less so around what the editorial sort of public intellectuals are delivering to us.
That's true. Things are much more fragmented
Yeah.
now. Last quick question on George and JFK and that era of your career. Yeah. Do you think he'd have made the turn into politics by now if he were still with us?
I do. You know, I had the, actually never thought about it until right at this moment, but obviously had that experience of working briefly, you know, around him. And then I later spent quite a bit of time with Beau Biden, who was our Attorney General in the state of Delaware and who I'd grown up with, and doing some work with him when he was preparing to run for governor. And I would say equally of Beau as of JFK, that there was a sense among the people closest to them that was directionally where they were going. And
they're just building their muscles, getting ready to jump into the fray.
That there was something in both their cases. Again, I did not know John Kennedy Jr. well at all, but just absorbing what I knew from people who knew him or have read about him. He seemed to have be interested in service. And Beau was definitely interested in service. And that's seemingly a less and less common interest, you know, among our peers. But no, I think they both would have gone into it, and who's to say, you know, where those careers would have gone. But
yeah. So unless Wikipedia has failed me again, you went back to Harvard Business School.
I did.
And were valedictorian. Is that true? Otherwise, somebody's really doing great things on your Wikipedia page for you.
What I was Harvard College has a graduation ceremony to which all the grad schools are invited. And so it's a lot of people. It's the college plus all the grad schools. And at that graduation ceremony, they have a Latin speaker, and they invite anyone from any of the graduate schools to submit a kind of an audition to speak at that graduation. I look back on it now, I think it's complete insanity, because I am almost incapable of giving a Thanksgiving toast to my immediate family. I really don't like speaking in any public forum. But my class there had started on September 10th, 2001. That was my first day of grad school.
Wow.
And it was halfway through my first period the next morning that 9/11 happened. And that experience had put a unique kind of cloud over, I don't know what the best way to describe it was. It was to be in an environment where you had kids from all over the world, from all different religions, suddenly in this very small place after this had happened was unusual. And I was kind of living through watching my friends have these different conversations, friends of mine who were coming at it from very different political points of view. One of my closest friends there, who was a Catholic priest, who was kind of convening everyone weekly together to kind of talk about how people were feeling about it. And I remember thinking at the time when this kind of note went around into, does anyone want to, throw their hat in the ring to speak at the university? I think they call it university graduation. I thought, maybe I can write about how weird it was to be in this environment that has a kind of political no-fly zone element to it because it's an academic environment. And maybe I can write about why this was such a powerful community to be a part of, leaving Harvard completely to the side as a brand, but just to be in an academic setting where people at the time were trying to love each other through what had been a really pretty traumatic event. And how can I do that? And so I talked about how it's really easy to look at someone and say and brand them, let's say because they're in business school, but that I found something transcendent about the experience of being in an environment where people were coming from such different places and able to come together in wartime, as I kind of described it. So anyway, I threw this thing off, and I was invited to deliver that in this, insane situation with 10,000 people and I think it was the first time that someone from the business school had done it, for obvious or maybe non-obvious reasons. But it was sweet for me because I got into business school by the skin of my teeth. I cannot add. I never should have probably been accepted, but I got in, I think, because I'd had this sort of entrepreneurial experience of helping launch a small magazine. So I'd kind of had a business experience, which is, I think, why they gave me a shot. But I really struggled there. Basically failed my finance class, almost failed my accounting class, it was a tough time for a lot of reasons. And it was very sweet because when the least likely, kid from our team, got up and gave this speech, that I had a lot of support from the community.
Well, it's funny you say that, writing the speech about that moment. Just before we were talking, you were talking about the Douglas Murray dragon, St. George in retirement. When all the big dragons are slain, people have to invent a dragon. They have to invent another monster because they're not born into a moment. But you found yourself in a moment there.
Well, and I think looking back on that now, there was 9/11, and then one of my closest friends at business school had been in a horrible car accident. And those two events kind of bookended my time there. And I wanted to talk about, again, this being in an unexpected place where people were able to come together. And yes, I love Doug Murray's St. George in Retirement Syndrome because it speaks to a much, much larger conversation, I think, which is how do we find meaning and what happens when we can't find it? And everybody's trying to figure out where to find meaning, where to find purpose. Elliot, my husband, who has often said that, when you're serving in the military and in a sort of combat environment in particular, you are experiencing what he refers to as like the crystal meth of purpose, right? You're living in a moment where you feel, well, I'm sure the left foot goes in front of the right foot, and there's just not a lot of room for debate because you're aligned in accomplishing this very specific thing. And real life with children and mortgages and opening the mail and all of that can often feel very absent, that clarity. And so he's spoken very eloquently on the subject of PTSD as it relates to purposelessness. But that's what Doug Murray, I think, is getting at in talking about St. George, because he certainly, did the most heroic thing ever. He killed the dragon. But what happens after? What happens when he goes home and has to pay his mortgage and open his mail? Yeah.
I love the crystal meth of purpose. That's a great line.
Isn't it?
If it weren't a broadcaster, I'd try to steal it for a book.
Take it. I'm sure Elliot would happily part with it.
So from Harvard Business School, you do not go to Wall Street and work private equity. You stay in the literary world. Did you know that you were going to keep on the sort of literary path?
No, is the short answer. I was applying for jobs in private equity, like everybody was. And I landed in the office of a guy I did not know and have not seen since, but I will never forget his name, a guy called Jonathan Nelson, who ran a company, at least at the time, called Providence Equity Partners. I'm out of touch with that world. And I remember in the interview, he said, I want to give you a piece of advice. I think you'd be really unhappy in this industry. You could probably do it or enter it in a way that would work for you, but I don't think you're really passionate about it. I think that, that's what it takes to succeed in anything. And it sounds now corny in retrospect, but I remember at the time, and he was, very highly thought of in that business. And I thought, well, if Jonathan Nelson tells me I can't work in private equity, I better not work in private equity. And then it was really yet another tragedy. George Plimpton had died. And George Plimpton, I like to say was, owner, coach, offensive line coordinator, defensive line coordinator, and quarterback, of the Paris Review, which was and is a very iconic literary magazine. And I sort of reached out to the folks there who I knew and said, hey, now I have this, or I'm about to have a business degree. Can I help out, And that led to me being hired there to really take a step back and say, what is this thing in the wake of George not being here, and how is it a viable, ongoing concern? And that was its own learning experience.
So what year was that?
So that was in 2004, 2003,
2003, 4. So you stayed there for a little bit. And then I know in 2008, your father passed away. And that created a whole opening of cans of information for you. Because as I read it, he served in World War II, and you only then in 2008 discovered that he had this whole life in espionage.
And not because he hid it from anyone, but more because if you do the math, so he and my mother had a big age difference. And I was born when he was in his mid-50s. And so by the time I was old enough to, have an adult conversation with him, by the time I was 15 or 16, and he was, in his 70s, it never occurred to me to say, hey, what was your life like 50 years ago? What was your life like 40 years ago? Mm-hmm. And it's one of the reasons that I often encourage, friends of ours now working in these lines of work to, write some of it down. You may not want to, or in fact, be able to talk about what you're doing now, but you may have a kid or a grandkid come to you in 20, 30, 40 years and say, what was it like in Damascus in 2007? What was it like in Fallujah in 2004? What did it feel like? And were you afraid? And 2 days after my father died, the former director of the FBI, who my father had worked a bit with, a guy called Louis Freeh, showed up at my mother's house in Delaware with a guy called Gene Sullivan, who was the former Chief Justice for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Services, something I didn't even know existed. And they came to deliver to my mother a citation that they had gotten declassified through Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense. And that citation was a description of only one operation that my father had led. And in that citation was this phrase, special operations. And I remember at the time thinking, and I knew my son was, barely 6 months old when my father had died, so I had a newborn. I was dealing with this loss. And I remember thinking, like, what is special operations? What is this thing? I'm going to find out. I'm going to find out what this is. And so I started reading every book I could on the subject of U.S. special operations, starting with World War II, where really there was the beginning of what we now would call special mission units, the OSS and the work that they did, which really gave birth to CIA. And now, if you go now to look at, I'll just give one example, the paramilitary division inside the CIA, part of which is called Ground Branch, they have as their symbol, a symbol which kind of is a nod back to OSS and back to that time. And as I like to say, my shelves very quickly filled up with books by men, for men, and about men. And I thought maybe I can write something that will, because of my spectacular lack of qualification or experience, will hit a different note. What I want to write about is the experience of loss, which of course I was going through at the time. And that was really the beginning of what became my first book, 11 Days. And again, was written very much as I was trying to figure things out. But back to all the choices that I'd made up until that point. I get into the best college I can get into, and I have to go to grad school, and I have to get a job that makes money, but also sounds good at a cocktail party. And everything was this slow, probably unconscious accumulation of the right thing. Mm-hmm. And, then my father died, and I sort of felt like everything I had done up until that point was completely meaningless. And to write a book, which sounded insane because it meant to take a risk, what was going to happen? People will think.
Had you not tried writing books during your undergrad years at Princeton or any of that? There was no novel in the bottom drawer somewhere?
No, because that would have been way too off book, way too, I had to, if you back to this my CV up until that point, as discussed, like I went with sure things. Like I'm going to work on a magazine startup. Well, it'll be for JFK Jr. I'm going to work on a literary magazine. Well, it'll be for Francis Coppola. Like, I look back now and see more clearly how I created this kind of risklessness. Mm-hmm. And then my father died, and I thought, maybe I'll try and write something. What's the worst that can happen? Some critic hates me. Nobody reads me. It's a horrible disaster. Like, my dad's dead. Like,
to your point, it would have been great if you had some, passed down some record or diary. My siblings and I talk about doing that even now. My dad's passed, but we're like, we should get video or, audio recorders and interview mom and find out what was going on, which would be great, but not as great as her having done it contemporaneously in the 60s, creating some record to pass on. But, to even do that now would be great. I'm sure you wish you could do it in 05 or 6 or 7 with your dad to just ask him a bunch of questions now. But, that generation famously, had this ethos of discretion and didn't talk a lot about what they did. I think every generation sort of who's served has done that. But I wish, it's one of the reasons I love spending time with much older people now. I wish I had thought, now that I'm all grown up, I certainly realize that you can have deep experiences that change your life in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. And he had them. I had just never been able to talk to him about them. After he died, my mother handed me something she'd kept in a drawer forever, which was an essay my father had written when he was a kid, when he was 16 years old. And that essay was called, I'm sure it was for a school assignment, but it was called Before I Die. And it was a list of things he wanted to do before he died, up to and including live and work in China, which he did. But in that essay also was this thing about wanting to experience sorrow, because it is only through experiencing sorrow that you can really understand what happiness feels like. These were like pretty deep thoughts for a 16-year-old. And yet you're arrogant as a kid. You think, what can my parents, what's the famous Mark Twain quote, at 15, I thought my father was an idiot. And by 22, I couldn't believe how much he'd learned. I think my mother and I both felt that we wanted to hold on to him, as anyone does who loses a parent or a loved one. And I now can see so clearly that the last 10 years have been an accumulation of attempts to hold on to him, tell his story. Mm-hmm. So your debut, 11 Days, as you said, that came out in 2013. Then you have Red, White, Blue in 2018, and now Ilium in 2024. And you are often compared to Le Carré, I think, because the description of Le Carré that you often hear of his work is that it's not a good espionage novel. It's a good novel. It happens to be about espionage. And that is the same as yours. It's just a brilliant, beautiful book. Happens to be about espionage.
Well, thank you for that comparison. I worked during COVID on a film adaptation of my last book, Red, White, Blue. And the reason I was doing that was the book had been optioned by a company called Ink Factory. Ink Factory is run by the Simon and Stephen Cornwell, the sons of David Cornwell, the sons of, otherwise known as John le Carré. So John le Carré sons, who are all grown up, have a company that they run where they adapt, his, in Hollywood we call it IP, right? They adapt the novels for film and television. And I thought, I'm working for these people. I better read up on John le Carré. And I started reading everything I could, not only the novels, but the great Adam Siskin biography of him. I read his collected letters, which one of his sons had edited. By the end of my time working with him, I'd been pretty steeped in Le Carré and had fallen in love with him. I couldn't believe that I had not only, gotten some education, but I had been an English major, and I'd never encountered on any syllabus John le Carré, because, he later sort of died at the tail end of COVID. And after he died, there was a sort of tsunami of pieces written by some of our greatest living writers saying, to your point, Le Carré was not only a great espionage writer. He was one of the great writers of the early 21st century, full stop. He really understood human emotion. I've been recommending his book, The Little Drummer Girl, to everyone, newly relevant in the wake of October 7th and those attacks in Israel. And he was an incredible master of empathy with his characters, I think. And I learned from that. And he also is great with glamorous locations. And so I thought maybe I could, coming off of that experience, I thought maybe I can write a book that is a kind of love letter to the Le Carré genre. So, and I found it was a great joy to write, and hopefully readers are connecting with the fun of moving with this narrator alongside her journey into the world of espionage.
Yeah, it really is great. Let's spend a minute on process then.
Sure.
And we can, I know you've written some short stories, and you're putting a short story collection together, and you write for film as well, but maybe sticking more with the espionage, or take it any way you want it. But how do you structure your writing? Are you outlining these ahead of time? Lots of twists and turns and secrets revealed in this. Do you know that all up front in outlines, or? With
this book, I did not outline. I knew, though, that there would be a beginning, a middle, and an end, which is, by the way, not always the case. Movies generally have beginnings and middles and ends. Novels don't have to, at least not the contemporary novel. And I knew that, back to sort of classic espionage story architecture, that I would have a woman enter a mission at a certain point in that mission's evolution, participate in that mission, and then be able to reflect back on it. So to the extent there was an outline in my head, it was those three pieces of story. We'd have to meet her. She'd have to be pulled into this world. We'd have to move through the world with her. And then I had to figure out a way for her to then reflect back on it, which I do by making her sort of older. The narrative voice is older than the action of the story. And that was the outline. And then I knew I wanted to situate it in an unexpected place. So this is not a book that takes place in the halls of Langley. It's a book that takes place in ordinary civilian. Yeah, exotic, but places that you or I might go. You can go travel to the western coast of France. You can go walk down a street in London. Places where you might not look at them and say, this is a war zone, or this is where a piece of a larger war is playing out. That was the thought there. Speaking of Little Drummer Girl by Le Carré, do you ever, and what's happening in Israel, do you ever grab headlines out of the news and use that as an inspiration for a story? Well, with Ilium, since you mentioned it, and this was not a headline, but I had known the story of a guy called Bill Buckley. Mm-hmm. Buckley was our CIA station chief in Beirut in the 80s, and Buckley was kidnapped and assassinated. And many, many years later, and I think it was in 2008, there was a car bombing in Damascus, Syria. And in that car bombing, which was later revealed to be a joint CIA Mossad operation, we killed a guy called Imad Mughniya. And Imad Mughniya was a Lebanese Hezbollah leader, very well known, but connected to the kidnapping and assassination of Buckley in Beirut in the 80s, because Mughniya, as a very young man, was the person who had killed Buckley. And those two stories together, once I had heard about both of them, gave up the backstory of Ilium, which is this idea that, or it's raising the question, if as a young person you lost someone very close to you and you were in one of these lines of work, working for one of these intelligence services, how long would you wait to get revenge? And so this is really the story. I don't know that car bombing in Damascus was a long revenge op coming out of the 80s. I think it was a lot of other reasons why, there were reasons to target Mughniya. But I wanted to tell a story where you enter the story thinking there are very clear heroes and villains, for lack of better phrases. And then if I can bring the reader all the way to the end of the book, if you stay with me, I can tell you the true, longer backstory of who these people are and maybe give you a sense of why they all made the choices that they made. Yeah, it becomes like a generational thing in perpetuity. You referenced those real-life events in the back of the book here, and you have a child in this book too, and it sort of opens the question like, well, is that child going to... It doesn't seem to be on that path really in your case, but a child could learn more and the cycle could continue. Definitely. Well, that child luckily has a passion for soccer or European football, which hopefully is going to lead him in a slightly different direction, which is not to say that there isn't a book to be written set in the world of European football and espionage. But
Let's see. Coffee, wine. What's the day like as you get to work?
Oh, I know who did you interview that said something about 4 cups of coffee by the mid-morning? I'm trying to remember who that was.
I mean, even I'm a little bit like that
maybe it was
at some
you.
points. Yeah, it might have been me. I think Anna Quinlan might be a big coffee drinker, and then she sort of throttles back to tea at some point.
I like to have a cup of coffee in the morning. And when I'm writing new material, that's going to happen in the morning or it's not going to happen. I'm not writing anything new after probably 2 p.m. But what I do like to do is review what I wrote in the morning and the evening. In the periods of time when I'm writing, I obviously have periods of time where I'm not writing or I'm banging my head against the wall writing a treatment document and not actual prose writing. But I read an interview with Joan Didion a long time ago, long before I ever started writing, and she talked about, this is my recollection now, dividing her workday into these 2 pieces. One is the new writing at the beginning of the day, and one is the review at the end of the day. And I like to do that. I like to sort of, my afternoon is other things, other work, administrative duties, child duties. And then if I can, as late as I can push it in the evening, I'm not a morning person, I'll sit down and review before bed what I've written.
I'm sharpest in the morning. So if I'm going to do new material, which I think takes the most focus, and that's the best time for that. And then in the evenings, I can try and set myself up for the best next morning too, so that I can sit down and get right to work.
I think so. All of that said, though, and I remember, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Taffy Brodesser Ackner, who wrote a book called Fleischman's in Trouble, and she's a journalist at the New York Times. But I remember her saying once, I write where I can. If I'm in the parking lot at school and I have 15 minutes, I'm writing. And I have had periods where my process just can't be precious because of the kids, and I'm sure like life, and so you will take the time that you can. And often that writing is, snatches of notes or ideas, or, when this book was kind of coming into being, it was always these interlocked killings, and then it was these Cy Twombly paintings, these paintings that Twombly did of the Trojan War. And I thought, I'm gonna come hell or high water, I'm going to marry Twombly with that Beirut assassination. And you have these little seeds, and then they give birth.
Well, that's true. It's a real luxury. It's the luxury of a working writer to be able to say, I'll write in the morning and edit and research and review in the afternoon. Because most people, it's catch as catch can. You're on the notes function of your iPhone on the train going to your law job or your teaching job or whatever it is. And I think for a lot of people, their first book was certainly that way.
And two of, I think, the greatest writers ever, Toni Morrison on the one hand and J.K. Rowling on the other, both, I hope I'm getting this correctly, I think of them both when they began writing as, writing on the subway or writing on the tube. And Toni Morrison was on her way working as an editor at Random House. And I do think there is something about the pressure that can bring out great work. And I certainly, that can come through a day job or through a child or through many other things.
How about a place to write? Is there a certain desk?
I'm really bad about that. I have a tiny desk that's 2 feet from my bed. It's probably literally, as Elliot's often saying, like, get out of this room. I would like to find a place to write that's further away from my bedroom, but I haven't gotten there yet. Because the second I start, I'm in it. And sometimes I have an hour and sometimes I have 3 hours. Those are the really good days. But I don't have any precious writing space or place. And I really admire writers who do, because I think was it Updike or McPhee would get up and with the bathrobe tie the bathrobe tie around the back of the chair so he couldn't move for a few hours. Those are both Princeton-adjacent writers. That's why I remember hearing that lore. But yeah, I think writers who have the best rituals probably are much more disciplined.
There's some 19th century writer who would have his valet throw away hide all his clothes so he couldn't go out and party and sort of lock himself in. He had some weird tradition. That's probably just a myth of the guy. I'll have to look up who that was.
But there's a lot of myth around process, and there's a lot of myth around discipline. And, my other famous favorite quote about process, back to Aaron Sorkin, is Sorkin was asked, how long does it take you to write a screenplay? And his answer, I'm paraphrasing, but his answer was, well, it takes 24 months. But 22 of those months looks like me lying on the couch watching ESPN. So, and Elliot will say I do a lot of watching ESPN. It's
all happening in the background.
That's the other thing. If you can afford or have the luxury to really have these long days at a desk, that's terrific. But a lot of my work is born out of pressure, time pressure.
Mm. How about research? And particularly with the espionage, because I was just watching this movie, and it was not a good movie on Netflix called Argylle. And the woman,
I haven't seen that.
Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it.
Oh.
That's the one that, like, the rumors that Taylor Swift wrote it. Did you heard this?
No, I didn't know that.
I don't think it's true. But.
It's not very good, but the main character is an author of spy fiction. And they're saying, you must secretly be a spy because, it turns out there was Le Carré and Ian Fleming and all these people.
Yeah, Graham Greene.
And Forsyth, they all turned out to be spies in real life. That's how they wrote such good spy fiction. And then, of course, she's like on amnesia and there's this whole thing. So how do you, either you're a spy or you are spy adjacent and know some folks. I mean, Elliot's military guy. You are tapped into the
I'm
community.
an employee of the Central Intelligence Agency. You're adding me for the first time on your podcast. No, I wonder why there has been that link with so many of the great iconic spy writers. And maybe it's because no one would be insane enough to try and write into this genre without having experienced it. I just don't believe that's true any more than you can't write into any other genre. Remember I wrote an action movie, which was completely crazy, but you just have to learn. For my research, I do a ton of reading, on these subjects, and I talk to people. When I started out trying to figure out my first book, 11 Days, which was set in the Navy SEAL community, I just listened. I just met with people and I listened. And I did the same thing with Red, White, Blue and the same thing with this book, although this book is much less about tradecraft and much more about, I think, a woman who maybe falls in love with a much older man, later develops a very deep bond with a child. Like the most important emotional pieces of this book are things that anyone could experience, even if they've not trained at the farm or worked at the CIA. But the research is widely available. I think you can Google most of it, and then you take creative license. Mm-hmm. Would this kind of operation really be run in this way? I don't know. I think it's plausible, and I really liked the idea that espionage happens in unconventional places. And that, Le Carré gets into that a bit too, but there was, in one of my favorite movies, Munich, which is a Steven Spielberg movie, pretty much based on the Mossad operation, which was the revenge operation, back to revenge, after the assassination of the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. And I think there you have character created, I don't know if it was by Eric Roth, who wrote the first draft, or Tony Kushner, who wrote the later draft, but you have a character of a sort of information broker who this Israeli agent needs to purchase information from. And he's, a guy who lives in a beautiful, house in Provence and loves cooking for his kids. And there's a sort of humanity to a guy doing really, really bad things. And that always stayed with me, back to the absence of binaries in this world, that I wanted to create a character in this sort of lapsed oligarch who's a really charismatic, loving guy, loves his son, loved his wife, and we learn his backstory later, but who's also done some really bad things. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's spend a minute on Ilium, which, again, is a terrific read.
Thank you.
And I wanted to say, one of the things I've loved about Hemingway is he does such a nice job in creating a sense of romance, not so much with a couple, but more with either a place or a feeling. In fact, I think Hemingway's less good at doing sort of a convincing romance between people as he is with, which maybe, he's a travel writer for a bit as well. But that's something you do so well here, is create this sense of atmosphere, like you can be there and feel the charm of it.
Thank you.
And creating atmosphere for an espionage piece is so critical too. And that's one of the things I love the most about the book.
I think so. I mean, the Cold War, when we were in it, and even up to and when John le Carré was writing into that world, there were so many kind of well-known locations, whether it's a dark street in Moscow or a hotel tea room in London or these places where espionage occurs, I'll call them broadly. And le Carré certainly wandered off that well-trod track. And I thought I wanted a place that was filled with families, but where someone could plausibly hide. And this location in France on the coast, Cap Ferret, Ferret, which is a little bit less known than Cap Ferrat, which is a glamorous seaside location, also beloved by oligarchs in the South. But I'd been told by a friend of mine that this was like sort of the Cape Cod of France, that it was very low-key, lots of families, lots of children, lots of surfers. And I thought that's the place where this very tragic thing will occur. And, I never went there. I just did my research. I hope to go there. But yeah, it was really the idea of a place you could hide with a family and with lots of children. I wanted there to be a feeling that there were kids on this compound and that was one of the things that kept it secure and made it difficult to infiltrate.
Well, you bring us into the story so well, too, because it's a sort of an unsuspecting lead character who gets pulled into this. And so as a reader, we're not even sure we're reading an espionage novel at first. It only sort of becomes that over time as our character begins to get drawn into the events of what's going on.
I didn't know how to start her story. And the chapter that opens the book now, where you have someone watching her, but you don't know who's watching her, came later. I wrote that almost right before I delivered the book. The book originally opened with her telling her story, her just starting to tell her story. But I thought in the end that I needed to do something in the opening pages that keyed the reader into this being a specific kind of book. The question, hopefully you come out of those first pages with, is why are people watching her? Is she in danger, or has she been chosen, or both? And you realize, again, if I did what I tried to do, you only realize in the last chapter of the book why exactly she was chosen. But, in my research, even for my last book, Red, White, Blue, this acronym kept coming up. And the acronym is MICE, M-I-C-E. And that acronym comes up in response to the question, why do people commit espionage? People commit espionage, broadly speaking, for one of four reasons. Money, because we pay you very well to do it. Ideology, because you believe in a cause greater than yourself, and so you will do anything to further that cause. Coercion, because we're going to harm you if you don't do it. Or ego, because it's sort of cool to brag to your friends that you've been involved in this covert operation. So money, ideology, coercion, ego. I kept hearing that. And then I was, again, talking to someone who worked at the CIA at the time, who said, Lee, you never ask someone to spy. He said, asking someone to commit espionage is like asking someone to marry you in this way. You ideally only ask the question once, and you only want to ask it when you know the answer will be yes. So then I had this, M-I-C-E, and also asking someone to commit espionage is like a marriage proposal. And that led me to this idea of, what if it's not money, ideology, coercion, or ego? What if it's love? What if the person who asks you to commit espionage is someone you love? Not only that, it's your husband. And not only that, you have to say yes because of this other set of circumstances, which I won't spoil, that are in the book. It's Craig Mazin, who you also had on the show. Love that episode. I've never met Craig Mazin, but he gave a talk, which then was turned into an essay. I was wondering if you had read it. It didn't come up on your interview with him, but it's called How to Write a Movie. And it's so brilliant. I will send it to you. But it's Craig Mazin's really taking us through Aristotle and how you construct the perfect plot. And one of the things he says, and I've listened to that talk so many times, and that I always remember, is he talks about how you have to punish your main character. You know, you really have to, in order for them to come out the other end and have gone the hero's journey and had the catharsis and, as he would put it, you know, come into alignment with a central dramatic argument. I mean, he's like such a brilliant guy that he almost talks like a scientist when he's talking about story. But it's very important for that main character to be punished. And I always remembered that. And I sort of put this narrator who goes unnamed, but I sort of punish her right from the beginning, where she's going to go through something really tricky, but that's going to free her up to be born into this new role, which she takes on, not really knowing what she's doing, but she's very good at it. It turns out. That
was fascinating. The mice thing, and also the Meisel.
Yeah,
Meisel.
Yeah, Meisel. I'll add that on.
That's great. So that was a fascinating piece of research that you got. Do you then have early readers, back, someone connected to, do you run it by a group of people before you send it into the editors, or not really?
I don't. I did that with 11 Days. With 11 Days, I sent it to every person I'd met in the Navy SEAL community because I was so terrified of making a mistake. Mm-hmm. Which really isn't the job of a novelist, right? It doesn't matter if you make a mistake. You're not in the fiction, investigative right. journalism business. But at the time, I hadn't, and I hope it's why I think my writing has grown. At the time, I wanted to get something right. Even if the story wasn't good, I at least wanted to get the facts right in that book.
Or the spirit of it, at least.
The spirit of it. Yeah. But with Ilium, no. I gave it to Elliot, of course, was my first reader. And my editor at Knopf, who's been there since the beginning with me over this whole decade, she's read everything I've written, Shelley Wanger, and I gave it to her. And I remember she said to me right when I called her and said, I think I have a new idea for something. She said, make sure it's moving. Make sure it's moving. And I remember—
That's insane, because that's like one of the nicest sentences in the New York Times Review. Didn't they say it's deeply moving?
Yes, you're right. You're right. And I think that's
mission accomplished.
Easier said than done. And I also remember when I was working with Stephen Cornwell, he sent me a note at one point in the process of that work. And he said, Lee, films are not great delivery devices for information. Great movies are delivery devices for emotion. And he said, you may remember a line, leave the guns, take the cannolis. You right. may remember a line, but what really stays with you from great movies is how they made you feel. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that that's also true of great books, at least of great books in my experience. You remember how you felt when you read them.
Well, that's a great lead to the next question. What is next for you? Will this be a film? Would you work on a book-to-film project for one of your own books? And I know you separately write for film as well.
Thank you for asking. So Ilium, this book has been optioned by a Mexican filmmaker called Alfonso Cuarón.
Oh, yeah.
For Apple TV.
Yeah.
I'm not writing it. I'm just hopefully will be a silent and reverent producer. I want to let Alfonso Cuarón put together the team that's best for him. So hopefully that will have an iteration. And I am finishing up a story collection that ends with a play. Oddly enough, I finally come back to theater all these decades later. I wrote a play in COVID, which I'm hoping to find a producing partner to work with on. And yeah, I have one or two other film and TV projects that I'm working on, but those I feel like are you never know where they're going to go, so it's hard to put.
I know the name Alfonso Cuarón. He's like one of the top 5 guys out there. But what films has he done? I can't think off.
Gravity. Did you see Gravity?
Okay, yeah.
He's done so many. I'll send you some other. But he's such an artist. And again, I tried to enter these genres, broadly speaking, war and espionage, not having lived them, and with my voice and as a woman. And I love the idea that this filmmaker, who I think of as incredibly artistic and poetic,
mm-hmm.
will enter this world as well.
Oh, well, good luck. Looking forward to seeing that on the screen.
Hope so.
And on to the lightning round with Lea Carpenter.
Oh, yes.
Your favorite book as a kid?
My favorite book, I was going to say Winnie the Pooh, but when I think about like my being grown up enough to really have a book, and a book that I read so many times, I think I have to mention Franny and Zoe, the J.D. Salinger book, which, I was the youngest of 6, and that's a family about a group of kids. And that was the first time I'd encountered this tone that was very different. So that was probably the first, piece of literature I remember reading. Although, which is not to say that Winnie the Pooh is not literature, but Pooh and Salinger. Yeah.
Yeah, there are only 2 books by Salinger I can even name. That's obviously one of them. But book or books you're reading now?
I am just finishing, as I think I mentioned, Nicholas Shakespeare's almost 900-page biography of Ian Fleming that is terrific and that I highly recommend.
I mean, it's going to take a lot to get me to pick that up, but your description of it earlier, I might just do it. And 900 pages.
And you can just, if you don't want to get to the Bond chapters, which are interesting but sad. That was a tough time in his life. You can read about his time during World War II, which is pretty terrific.
Yeah. Yeah, I know he, I remember doing some looking into Operation Mincemeat, which is was made into the movie with Colin Firth.
I never saw the movie.
He helped write the Trout Memo, famously, which had the whole operation sort of specced out in there.
Yeah.
Let's see. Least attended book event ever?
All of them. All of them. Really, it's writing a book is a great act of lunacy on the one hand, maybe curiosity on the other, but promoting a book is unending humility, and which is not to say humiliation, but I guess I could tell you that the first book event I ever did for 11 days was in Atlanta, at a Barnes & Noble in Atlanta, and my mother came with me. This is it makes me feel like I was 6 years old, but my mother said, it's your first book event, I'm coming to Atlanta. And so she came, and I think she had 2 friends there. And so the book event was meant to start at 7. It was 6:53, and there was my mother and her 2 friends, and that's it. And she came up to me and she said, "Could you wait a moment? We're just going to go next door to Starbucks, and get some coffee."
Oh, that's funny.
And I said, "No, I can't wait a moment. This is my big debut, and we're starting at 7." And anyway, so I gave the talk to my mother and her 2 friends, and after it was over, I went to the manager of it. This was, a big Barnes & Noble. And I went to the manager and I said, thank you. I'm so sorry I didn't get more people. And I'll never forget, she said, honey, Jimmy Salter was here 2 weeks ago and he only had 3 people too. And I thought, like, James Salter, and who's just such a terrific writer. Mm-hmm. But I think that was my introduction to the reality of most book tours.
I thought you were going to say your mother went over to Starbucks and started handing out 20s to recruit people to come into the audience.
She would have been just the person to do that. But no, every once in a while you do an event. I did an event recently at St. John the Divine here in New York City with Griffin Dunn, who has to give one more book plug, fantastic memoir coming out in about 2 weeks. And I thought, who's going to make the journey to come up here? And that ended up being a really nicely attended event. So you get those sometimes.
What percentage over the last couple of book tours that you've done, what percentage of events would you say are in conversation versus you just getting out there and giving your talk?
Now almost all of them. And I'm so, what's the right word? Merciless. I try and choose the person who I know will get people to come. So in the case of Griffin Dunn, I thought, even if nobody comes for me, everyone will come for Griffin, who's just so terrific. So I think teaming with someone else makes it easier, and at times can widen the net of the audience.
Yeah. Well, once Ilium is made into a blockbuster film by Cuarón, everyone's been, Lee, will you do an event with me? Because people will actually come if you're there.
I'm available. and I would, I love helping other writers. We're all kind of weaving our baskets now, just trying to, with obvious exceptions, but it's very hard, as you know, to sell books.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And getting harder.
Yeah.
The tell that a person in our lives is actually secretly a spy.
The tell that someone is actually secretly a spy, probably if they very aggressively deny knowing anything about the spy business, or just seem to know nothing about anything. I mean, my father, I found a letter that my father had written home to his father during the war. And in it, he basically said, you know, Dad, I'm learning that the more people talk about their involvement with covert activity, the less likely they've ever been involved with any covert activity. So I think the tell would be that they don't have no interest in the subject matter.
Okay. So hard to spot those, I think.
Yeah.
Let's see, the movie or the TV show that best captures espionage?
Well, I'd have to go back to Munich again, which is totally terrific. In television, there have been so many, but a personal favorite of mine is The Bureau, which is a French series about, it's being adapted, I think, for a U.S. audience, but it's a French series, but kind of blew up on Netflix about the DGSE, which is the French Domestic Intelligence Service. It's so good. Fauda, I think, is terrific. The Departed is one of my favorite movies of all time. That, again, is more about domestic intelligence with the FBI rather than foreign intelligence.
Departed, is that the DiCaprio one?
Yes.
Yeah, I saw that.
Where you have
that was good.
Leonardo DiCaprio and Matt Damon, and you see their characters, back to Craig Mazin's Punishing, evolve in complete parallel into kind of each becoming the other one. I think what those few shows and movies I've mentioned share is that they are able to allow you to empathize for all sides. Mm-hmm. And whether or not that is politically astute or politically viable from a story perspective, that is what I think makes the viewer or the reader feel the most. Yeah. When you feel the tragedy that good people can do bad things and bad people can hug and love their kids, you know? Mm-hmm.
All right, last question for Lea Carpenter. One piece of advice for the audience.
Scroll less, read more.
I like that. Good.
Read more. Read more books.
Great. Lea, thank you. What a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Doug. That was terrific.